Okay, hey everyone. We're going to start here with our second lesson on World War I. So please make sure you have this worksheet out in front of you. How did World War I differ from previous conflicts? We're going to work through this worksheet and some pictures and some videos that go with this worksheet here. So this is the one that you're going to fill out by the end of this video. So make sure that this is in front of you. Okay. So let's get started on focusing here of how did World War I differ from previous conflicts. If you remember, this was called the War to End All Wars, or the Great War, because it was so much different than any wars that Europeans or those outside of Europe had ever experienced. So remember that in the last video, the first lesson here, we talked about this idea of what converts a controlled explosion into a monumental explosion. That is the real question. So based on what we talked about in the last lesson in regards to the First World War, how would you respond to the quote above? So think about that answer right now. If you're sitting here, if you're doing this with a group with your friends, maybe stop and just answer the question here. See what you guys can come up with. So hopefully something that you guys came up with has to do with this idea here, the acronym MANIA that we discussed previously. That basically Europe in the 19th century and the relationship between European powers in the 19th century was a powder keg ready to explode. You have militarism and these alliances and imperialism and nationalism and the rise of Germany and the competition between these powers and the rivalries between these powers and the balance of power trying to be maintained, all coming together just waiting to explode. And that the explosion there was that assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And that's what kind of launches Europe here into the war. It creates a situation like this cartoon here, so that by 1914 you basically have all these European powers at each other's throats, ready to destroy each other. So war came to Europe during harvest time, and most ordinary people heard the news as they worked in the fields. They reacted not with enthusiasm, but with shock and fear. Other people, however, especially the intellectuals and the young city dwellers, met the news with euphoria. Many of them had long expected a war, and they saw it as a liberating release of the pressure that would resolve the various political, social, and economic crises that had been building for years. In the capitals of Europe, people danced in the streets when their governments announced formal declarations of war. When the first contingents of soldiers left for the front, jubilant crowds threw flowers at the feet of departing men who expected to return victorious after a short time. So generally across Europe, there was much enthusiasm and support for the war. I mean, and this is on both sides, Germany, France. In fact, there was a leader of a French socialist party who was preaching against the war, who was assassinated at the end of July, right before at the end of July, right before the war started. So that showed the amount of support here for the war. You can see here are some happy Berlin students who can't wait to get in there to enlist. You have troops here on their way to the front or to training. Hands up in the air, flowers being given to them. In this video here, this is some stock footage of German troops leaving for the war. So you can see a parade there. You see them throwing their caps out on the trains, kissing their wives or their loved ones goodbye. Generally pretty pumped about getting ready to go fight for their country. And that's pretty much what the situation was here, is that it was believed that this would be a short war on both sides. You're going to go out, you're going to wallop your enemy, the boys will be home by Christmas, everybody will be happy. Reality, however, very quickly crushed any of these expectations of a short and triumphant war. The wars in the past were not fought with these new industrial-style weapons, these new weapons, and a new type of warfare formed during World War I. So what we're going to do here is we're going to watch a short clip from this movie called All Quiet on the Western Front. It is a kind of an older movie, it's black and white, but it still to this day shows one of the best depictions of what's been known now as trench warfare. So in the box on your worksheet, as you watch this clip, it's about 3 minutes long, just make some notes in your box about describing the fighting, what kind of weapons are used, what kind of fighting styles, things like that. Okay, so even though that video was, a number of years old, I think it does give a really great sense of what this style of trench warfare was like. By the way, All Quiet on the Western Front was actually based on a book that was written by somebody who served and fought during World War I, and still to this day is one of the best depictions of what the realities of war were like. So this new style of warfare that was just depicted in the video, that was what people were not expecting. So let's talk about how this style of warfare kind of developed and where it came from. So the German strategy in August of 1914 had been planned long in advance by Count Alfred von Schlieffen, the German chief of staff until 1905. So notice here, I had mentioned in the other video that this was a war that was long expected. People knew it was coming. So you can see here that Count von Schlieffen developed his plan well before the war had even started. But basically, the essence of the strategy was this: is in order to understand the Schlieffen plan, you got to kind of look at a map of Europe here. So here's Europe during World War I. You have the orange powers here that were allied together, your central powers, and then the green are your allied powers. So notice the location of Germany here. Germany was surrounded by their enemies. You had the Russian Empire there to their east, and you had France there to their west. So Germany was well aware that if a war erupted, they were going to be stretched thin and be fighting on a two-front war. The plan was to avoid this. So hence, Schlieffen developed this idea that they were going to, the essence of the strategy was to have the German troops sweep through Belgium, which, by the way, at the start of the war, Belgium was a neutral country. So they were going to violate that neutrality, sweep through Belgium, overwhelm the French defenses in one swift onslaught, having about 90% of their army used for that purpose. And they were just going to pound right through France and then reach Paris within 6 weeks and be able to take France right away. The remaining 10% would hold off Russia. The idea of this plan was that it was going to take Russia about 6 weeks to mobilize their troops together because they had such a large army, such a vast empire. And they were correct about that it did take Russia about 6 weeks to get their army together. So the plan is to take advantage of this and pound right into Paris before Russia was able to mobilize all of their troops. Sounds like a great plan, right? As soon as Russia announced their intentions to mobilize, the Schlieffen Plan went into effect, and the German army launched a devastating, or at least tried to launch a devastating attack into France. They invaded Belgium, and at that point, that's when Great Britain entered the war because Belgium's neutrality was violated. So the plan was to defeat France in 6 weeks and then use her modernized rail system. Remember, Germany had rapidly industrialized, and they were going to use this rail system to move the troops from the French operation swiftly across Germany to the Russian front. Russia would then be attacked and defeated. Sounds like a great plan, right? Simple enough. Go in, defeat your enemy fast, move the troops across the country, defeat that enemy fast, boys will be home by Christmas, Germany would emerge as the most powerful nation in Europe. But here's what the German troops did not anticipate. They did not anticipate trench warfare. The German armies do move into France pretty quickly. They get within 30 miles of Paris, but at that point, the French army began to dig their trenches. And they dug trenches. And the German troops were stopped here at the First Battle of the Marne. The First Battle of the Marne shows, it's kind of the first battle that shows what this new style of war is going to be like. So the Germans then retreated, dug trenches of their own, and next thing you know, you have these two lines, miles upon miles of trenches, with nobody moving. And that's kind of part of this style of trench warfare, is that it produced a stalemate because it was very difficult to gain any land. As you guys saw in that clip there, the land between the two trenches was something called no man's land. And if you go back and look at that clip again, or if you remember what was in the clip, what happened to the men as they tried to stream across no man's land? I mean, they're basically just decimated as they go. So really, you would gain, if you gained any territory, if you're able to overwhelm your enemy's trench, very quickly, they would push you back. You would overwhelm them, push you back, and it produced not very little gain at very high cost. And so pretty much right away, the Schlieffen Plan is a failure, and all hopes of a quick war are ended very quickly. So if we continue reading on the worksheet, once France was defeated, Germany and Austria-Hungary could concentrate their forces against the Russian army. However, quite unexpectedly, the Belgians put up a gallant resistance, and the German attack was stalled long enough to upset the timetable. The British were able to land troops in Europe, and the war degenerated now into a struggle for position that was characterized by trench warfare. New weapons such as the machine gun, the tank, and barbed wire eliminated thousands of men as attacks failed and comrades were left to die in the region between the trenches called no man's land. And it's clear pretty quickly that this was going to be a quite different war than had ever been fought before. So we're not going to look at this too much right now in the video, but I am going to post a link here to this website for further information for you guys. This will take you to a place called Class Zone, which will load this interactive thing about trench warfare. You might see a map before this where you just have to click on New York, click on the state of New York, and then this will load here. And this gives you, it's a little more interactive information about trenched warfare. So you can see here all the different types of new weapons that are involved, what life in the trenches were like, what no man's land was like, a little information on that. So please go to this at your convenience while you're working on this worksheet, maybe when you're doing the stuff on the back here, just to get a little more information on this. So, you'll click on a part, and this part
My first spell in the line lasted 3 weeks. Water was scarce, and even the tea ration was so short that...
So this part has like some information, some personal accounts of life in the trenches. This part here talks about planes and how airplanes were used.
World War I was the first time airplanes were used in combat.
Okay, so a lot of great information about, machine gun use, no man's land.
No man's land was a term soldiers used to describe the land between their trench and the enemy's. It was a horrific combination of mud-filled craters, barbed wire, unexploded shells, quicksand, and dead soldiers.
Okay, so at your convenience, just click on this link and go check out some more of this, some more information about warfare during World War I. Okay. All right, so now what you're going to do is you're going to flip over to the back of your worksheet, and on the back of the worksheet there you have some personal accounts of combat during World War I. Read through these documents and answer those questions on the bottom of the page, please. You can pause this video here at this point and do that. Okay, so now once you've finished doing that worksheet there, we are going to discuss these questions in class, so please make sure you have that stuff answered. But now let's kind of wrap this up here. How was World War I different from previous wars? See if you can come up with a list in your head of some of these differences. Again, if you're sitting with a group and you guys are watching this together, maybe just throw out a couple ideas here with each other. Okay. So one way in which it differed here was the new technology which developed trench warfare. We're going to watch another short little video here about what life in the trenches and life during World War I was like.
Life in a trench, I'd like to explain in one word: horrific. It's mud, it's death, it's rats, it's stench, and soldiers develop an attitude in a trench that everybody is going to die.
Life in the trench was abysmal. There were several lines of trenches, and the front line trenches, of course, were the most dangerous because they were constantly under fire. Into me!
The Germans dug assiduously, building dry, safe, and comfortable trenches for themselves, with bunkers that actually had electricity and sometimes running water. The British and French, who were convinced that they were never going to be there for that long, didn't spend nearly the same effort. And so their trenches tended to be muddy and wet and not that safe.
Disease ran rampant. It was very difficult to get any sort of sleep, a decent hot meal, keep your clothes dry, and more importantly, to keep your sanity.
There were so many health problems of just simple disease that took much more men out of combat than direct fire.
I think one word that would surprise people about life in a trench: boredom. A lot of time is spent just sitting, cleaning tools, and being scared to death the battle's going to start any minute.
Was just the day-to-day monotony, being trapped in this very small space and fighting for a war that's really fought in inches.
The idea of open warfare, of fighting out into what they called no man's land, wasn't working. The technology of the war had advanced so much with machine guns, artillery that could lob shells a mile. It became mostly a defensive war early on, and as a defensive war, you wanted to protect your troops, so the miles and miles of trenches were built.
There were often bodies buried in the sides of trenches, bodies lying out in the open in front of the trenches. The soldiers were experiencing not only the war that they were fighting at the moment, but the war that had been going on throughout those trenches for all of the years of the war.
A young lieutenant writes his mother and says, "I haven't been killed yet, but it's only a matter of time." That's typical of the way soldiers felt about life in the trench. You just did it. You existed day to day, tried to go on, keep your chin up, but one day, the bullet was going to have your name on it. You were going to perish. You weren't going home.
Okay. So trench warfare produced an unprecedented amount of casualties, and again, for very little gain. You know, the very beginning of the war, just like the Schlieffen Plan had, a lot of the plans that the major powers had to win the war was massive, strong attacks, like defeat your enemy quickly. But trench warfare made that impossible. And rather than defeating the enemy quickly, what happens is the war disintegrates into what's called a war of attrition, which basically means a stalemate, going back and forth, gaining very, very little. And for a number of years, as the video kind of said, which is pretty depressing, is that these soldiers were just living, existing, hoping that a bullet didn't find them, even though they expected a bullet to eventually find them. In addition, there were some other new types of warfare here besides, or new weapons that were used too, including chemical weapons. So if you guys remember that the second industrial revolution had a big focus on steel production as well as chemical production, especially in Germany. So new chemical weapons are used: poison gas, mustard gas, which just destroyed people's skin. If you inhaled it, it could kill you. And you can see here that the new gas masks had to be used. I mean, just the style of fighting was nothing that had ever been seen before, which resulted in more casualties than had ever been seen. You also have new weapons or new things used as weapons, such as airplanes. World War I marks the first time where airplanes are used in warfare. They're going to be a little more significant by World War II because they are still a new technology. However, there were a significant amount of dogfights in the air and war in the sky that took place as well. So there'll be more on that in a later lesson about a little bit more about trench warfare, a little bit more of how the war impacted people later on. Okay, so that concludes here this lesson. Make sure that you have that whole worksheet done. Make sure you followed any of the other instructions that are on the website here, and make sure, again, I want to just remind everybody, be sure to be jotting down any questions you have, and don't be afraid to ask them when we get back into class. Okay, thanks for watching, guys, and we hopefully. I mean, no, I will see you, or I'll see you in the next video. All right, thanks, guys. Bye.